They fired her in front of everyone, but they had no idea who was watching. The crystal chandeliers above cast a golden glow across the private dining room, reflecting off polished marble floors and glasses of untouched wine that cost more than most people's weekly rent. And in the center of it all stood Alicia Carter, her hands trembling slightly at her sides as the manager's voice cut clean through the soft hum of conversation like a blade through silk. "You're fired. Right now. And don't even think about coming back." The room didn't erupt. It didn't need to, because the silence that followed was heavier than noise, filled with the quiet satisfaction of people who had just witnessed someone fall from a place they never believed she deserved to stand in the first place. And somewhere near the back, a woman let out a soft, amused laugh, the kind that didn't bother to hide itself, the kind that spread like a ripple as others leaned closer, whispering, watching, judging. Alicia didn't move at first, her breath shallow, her eyes fixed somewhere just past the manager's shoulder, as if she could disappear into the space between seconds, as if invisibility, the one skill she had perfected over years of working double shifts and keeping her head down, might still save her now. But invisibility didn't exist under chandeliers this bright, not when every gaze in the room had already decided what she was worth. "Did you hear me?" the manager continued, louder now, emboldened by the audience, straightening his tailored jacket as though authority lived in the fabric. "We don't tolerate theft here." The word hung in the air, ugly and heavy, and for a brief moment, something flickered across Alicia's face, not guilt, not fear, but something quieter, something steadier, like a refusal to break in the way they expected her to. And when she finally spoke, her voice was soft but clear. "I didn't take anything, sir. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't a challenge. It was truth simple, unembellished, and somehow that made it worse, because truth didn't entertain a room hungry for drama." And the manager's lips curled slightly, as if disappointed by the lack of spectacle. "Of course you didn't," he replied, his tone dripping with condescension. They never do. A few guests shifted in their seats, one man swirling his bourbon slowly, as if this were part of the evening's entertainment, while another woman dabbed her lips with a linen napkin, eyes scanning Alicia from head to toe with a quiet judgment that said everything without a single word spoken. The accusation wasn't about proof, it never was. It was about position, about who was allowed to be believed and who wasn't. And in this room, dressed in a simple black uniform while surrounded by tailored suits and silk dresses, Alicia already knew which side she stood on. Somewhere near the front, a glass tipped, red wine spilling across the edge of the table and dripping slowly onto the polished floor. But no one rushed to clean it this time. No one called for assistance, because all attention had shifted, locked onto the woman standing alone in the center of the room, as if she were a scene being performed for them. "You can leave now," the manager added, stepping slightly closer, lowering his voice just enough to feel personal, just enough to sting. "Before I have security escort you out." The words landed harder than any raised voice could, not because of the threat, but because of the assumption that she would walk away quietly, that she would accept the version of herself they had already written. And for a second, just a second, her fingers tightened, the smallest movement, the smallest sign that something inside her refused to fold. But then it was gone, replaced by that same stillness, that same quiet dignity that didn't beg and didn't break. Across the room, at a table set slightly apart from the others, a man who hadn't spoken all evening finally lifted his gaze, his dark eyes settling on the scene with a focus that cut through the room more sharply than any voice had. And though no one seemed to notice him yet, though the manager continued speaking and the guests continued watching, something had already shifted, subtle but undeniable. Like the moment before a storm changes direction, like the second before silence becomes something else entirely. And Alicia, standing there under the weight of every assumption, every whisper, every judgment, had no way of knowing that the night they thought they were ending for her was only just beginning. Alicia bent down slowly, her movements careful and deliberate, as if the entire room might shatter if she moved too quickly. Her fingers brushing against the polished floor where the spilled wine had begun to spread in a dark, uneven stain that mirrored the weight pressing against her chest. And for a moment she considered simply walking away, leaving the mess behind, leaving the whispers, leaving the eyes that followed her every motion. But habit was stronger than humiliation. And dignity. The kind she had built piece by piece through years of being overlooked would not let her leave something undone even now, even here. So she reached for a cloth from the nearby service cart, her hands steadying as she worked, the simple act grounding her in a way nothing else could. While behind her the manager exhaled sharply in annoyance. "I told you to leave, not to pretend you still work here." His voice carrying just enough irritation to remind everyone who held control in this room. And a few guests chuckled again, softer this time, as though the entertainment had become quieter but no less satisfying, and yet Alicia did not respond, did not look up, because she had learned long ago that some battles were not fought with words, especially not in rooms where words were twisted before they ever had a chance to stand on their own. The scent of expensive cologne and aged whiskey lingered in the air, blending with the faint metallic tang of the spilled wine. And somewhere in the distance, a pianist continued to play, the soft notes of a familiar melody drifting through the tension, as if unaware that the room had shifted into something else entirely, something colder, something sharper. And at the far table, the man who had been silent until now leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers resting lightly against the rim of his glass without lifting it, his gaze never leaving the woman on the floor, and there was no amusement in his expression, no curiosity either. Only a quiet calculation that suggested he was seeing more than what was being shown. "Security!" the manager called out, raising his hand slightly as though summoning assistance was nothing more than a routine gesture. But the word landed differently this time, heavier, final. And Alicia paused for just a fraction of a second before continuing to wipe the floor, not because she had not heard him, but because she had, and she understood exactly what it meant. And still, she chose not to rush, not to scramble, not to give them the image they expected of someone being removed, because even now, even at the edge of losing everything, she would leave on her own terms. Two men in dark suits appeared near the entrance, their presence quiet but unmistakable, and the room shifted again, conversations fading entirely now as the reality of the moment settled in, and one of them took a step forward, his posture respectful but firm. "Ma'am," he began, his voice low, professional. But before he could continue, a single sound cut through the space, not loud, not aggressive, but precise enough to stop him mid-word. The faint click of a glass being set down against the table, and suddenly every movement in the room seemed to hesitate, as though the sound had drawn an invisible line no one dared to cross. The man at the far table stood, slowly, deliberately, the kind of movement that did not demand attention, and yet commanded it anyway, his chair sliding back with a soft scrape against the marble floor. And only then did a few guests begin to recognize him, their expressions shifting from casual interest to something far more cautious, more aware. Because power, real power, did not announce itself loudly. It revealed itself in moments like this, in the way a room adjusted without being told to, in the way voices lowered instinctively, in the way even the manager's posture stiffened as he turned, his confidence faltering just enough to betray uncertainty. Vincent Moretti adjusted the cuff of his sleeve as he stepped forward, his pace unhurried, his presence cutting through the space with a quiet authority that needed no explanation. And when his eyes finally lifted to meet the manager's, there was no anger there, no visible judgment, only a calm that felt far more dangerous than any raised voice could ever be. And for the first time that evening, the manager hesitated, his next words catching somewhere between his throat and his pride. Because something had changed, something he could not quite name. And as Vincent's gaze shifted briefly toward the floor, toward the woman still kneeling, still cleaning, still refusing to crumble under the weight of every assumption placed on her, the room held its breath without realizing it, suspended in that fragile space between what had been decided and what was about to be undone. Vincent did not raise his voice, and that was what unsettled the room the most, because silence from a man like him carried more weight than shouting ever could. And as he took another step forward, the soft echo of his shoes against the marble seemed to replace every other sound, even the piano, even the whispers, until it felt as though the entire space had narrowed to a single moment that no one could step out of. And when he finally spoke, his tone was even, measured. "You said she stole something," he said, not as a question, but as a statement that demanded precision. And the manager straightened instinctively, forcing a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Yes, sir. We have reason to believe reason," Vincent repeated, cutting him off gently, almost politely. But the interruption landed with finality, and for a brief second, the manager's confidence faltered again, his words slowing as though he was suddenly aware that each one mattered more than it had a moment ago. There was an item reported missing from one of the guests, and she was the last one assigned to that section. He continued, gesturing vaguely toward the tables as if the explanation itself might fill in the gaps he could not prove. And Vincent's gaze did not waver, did not soften. It simply remained steady and unreadable before shifting slightly toward the guests seated nearby. "Which item?" he asked, and a woman in a pale silk dress lifted her hand, hesitantly now, as if unsure whether she still wanted the attention. "My bracelet," she said, her voice quieter than before. It was on the table, and then it was gone, and for a moment her certainty seemed to flicker under the weight of his attention, and Vincent inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her without breaking the rhythm of the moment. "And you saw her take it?" he asked, and the woman paused, just long enough for doubt to enter the room. "Not exactly," she admitted, glancing briefly at the manager as though seeking confirmation, but she was there, and after she left, it was missing, and the explanation hung in the air, thinner now, less convincing than it had sounded moments before. And Vincent let the silence stretch, not rushing to fill it, allowing the absence of certainty to settle into every corner of the room until even those who had been watching with amusement began to shift in their seats, the weight of assumption suddenly heavier than before. Alicia remained on the floor, her hand still resting against the cloth, though she had stopped moving, her head slightly lowered, not in submission, but in restraint, because she could feel the shift, could sense that something was unfolding beyond her control, and yet she did not insert herself into it, did not speak again, because she understood that this was no longer about defending herself. It was about something larger, something that was beginning to surface in the space between accusation and truth. Vincent took another step, closing the distance just enough to stand within the center of the room, his presence now impossible to ignore. And he glanced briefly at the security men who had been called, their posture still and waiting, before returning his attention to the manager. "And your procedure," he said calmly, "is to accuse without confirmation in a room full of guests." And though his tone remained level, there was something beneath it now, something colder, something that made the manager swallow before answering. "We take these matters seriously, sir. You cannot risk being wrong," Vincent corrected, his voice still quiet, still controlled, but sharper now, more precise, and the words landed in a way that left no space for deflection. And for the first time, the manager had no immediate response, his authority unraveling not through confrontation, but through exposure. Through the simple act of being asked to explain what he had assumed could go unquestioned. A faint movement caught Vincent's attention, something small, something easily overlooked, and his eyes shifted downward, settling on Alicia's wrist where the edge of her sleeve had slipped back slightly, revealing a worn bracelet, simple in design, nothing like the expensive piece that had been reported missing, but something about it held his gaze for a fraction longer than expected, as though it carried a familiarity he could not immediately place, and without announcing it, without drawing attention to the moment. He stepped closer, just enough for the detail to come into clearer view. And in that second, something in his expression changed, not visibly to the others, but enough that the air around him seemed to tighten, as if a thread from the past had just been pulled into the present. He straightened again, his attention returning to the room, but the shift had already happened. And when he spoke next, there was a new weight behind his words, something that suggested the outcome of this moment had already begun to change. "No one leaves," he said simply, his gaze moving across the guests, the staff, the manager, and finally resting, just briefly, on Alicia once more, not until we find out what actually happened, and the room, which had once been so certain, so quick to judge, now held its breath for a different reason entirely, because the story they thought they were watching was no longer the one being told. The manager's mouth opened slightly as if to protest, but no words came out, because Vincent's instruction had not been loud, yet it carried the kind of authority that did not invite argument. And around the room, subtle shifts began to ripple outward. Guests who had been leaning back in their chairs now sat a little straighter. Glasses paused mid-air. Conversations that had once whispered now dissolved entirely into a silence that felt deliberate, chosen. And at the center of it all, Alicia slowly rose to her feet, the cloth still in her hand, her movements unhurried, composed, as if she had decided that no matter how this ended, she would not leave the room smaller than she had entered it. And for the first time since the accusation, she lifted her gaze, not defiantly, not challengingly, but steadily, meeting the space in front of her without retreat. The woman in the silk dress shifted in her seat, her fingers brushing lightly against her bare wrist where the missing bracelet had once been. And now that all attention had turned toward truth rather than assumption, her earlier certainty seemed to waver under the weight of scrutiny, while the manager cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of a situation that had already begun slipping beyond his reach. "Sir, with all due respect, we have procedures for this," he said carefully, choosing his words with more caution than before. "We cannot delay service for every minor issue." And Vincent turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge him, his expression unchanged. "This is not a minor issue," he replied, his voice calm, almost conversational. Yet it carried through the room with unmistakable clarity. "It is a matter of accusation," and the word landed differently this time, no longer casual, no longer convenient, but precise, and suddenly no one seemed eager to claim it so quickly. One of the security men stepped forward again, hesitating only briefly before addressing Vincent directly. "Sir, would you like us to review the cameras?" he asked, and the suggestion hung in the air like a line drawn between speculation and fact. And Vincent nodded once, a small motion, but one that shifted the entire direction of the evening. "Yes," he said simply. And immediately the room reacted, not outwardly, not dramatically, but in the subtle tightening of posture, in the exchanged glances, in the quiet realization that whatever came next would not be shaped by opinion, but by evidence. The manager's confidence faltered further now, his hand moving to adjust his tie, a gesture that no longer masked his discomfort, because where there had once been control, there was now exposure, and exposure left little room for performance, while Alicia stood still, her hands now resting lightly in front of her, the cloth folded neatly, as though she had already completed her task and was simply waiting for the rest of the room to catch up. Vincent's gaze drifted once more, briefly, toward her wrist, toward the worn bracelet that did not belong in a place like this, and yet somehow carried more presence than anything else in the room. And a memory flickered at the edge of his mind, indistinct but persistent, something tied not to wealth or status, but to a moment long before this one. And though he did not speak of it, though he did not reveal the connection forming quietly beneath the surface, it altered the way he stood, the way he watched, the way he listened, as though the situation had shifted from an inconvenience to something personal, something that demanded not just resolution, but understanding. Minutes passed, though they felt longer, stretched thin by anticipation, until a staff member approached discreetly, a tablet in hand, the security footage already cued, and the manager stepped forward quickly, as if eager to control the narrative once more. "There is no need to involve the guests in this," he said, his voice tight. "We can handle it privately." But Vincent did not look at him, did not acknowledge the suggestion, his attention fixed instead on the screen as it was positioned where he could see it clearly, and the room leaned in without moving, every eye drawn to the quiet glow of the device, because now, finally, the story would no longer belong to assumptions. As the footage began to play, the earlier moments of the evening unfolded in silent clarity, servers moving between tables, guests laughing, glasses being set down and picked up. Ordinary actions that had seemed insignificant at the time now taking on new meaning. And there, in the corner of the frame, the table in question came into view, the bracelet resting exactly where the woman had described, untouched, unnoticed, until a figure entered the frame, not Alicia, not the person they had all watched moments ago, but someone else entirely. And though no one spoke, though no one reacted outwardly yet, the shift in the room was immediate, unmistakable, because truth, once revealed, did not need to announce itself loudly. It simply existed, undeniable. And in that quiet moment, as the image continued to play, the weight of everything that had been said, everything that had been assumed, began to settle in a way no one could ignore. And Vincent remained still, his expression unchanged. But his presence now carried something more, something final, because the outcome of this night had already turned. And there was no going back. No one spoke as the footage continued to play, but the silence no longer belonged to judgment. It belonged to realization. And slowly, unmistakably, the truth began to take shape on the glowing screen. The missing bracelet clearly visible for several seconds before a hand entered the frame, not hesitant, not uncertain, but casual, practiced, as if the act itself required no second thought. And the figure who took it was not dressed in a uniform, not moving with the quiet efficiency of staff, but wearing a tailored jacket that blended seamlessly with the guests. Someone who had never been questioned simply because they had never been expected to be. And as the image froze, the room seemed to tighten around that single moment, every eye shifting, recalculating, reassigning the narrative they had so easily accepted minutes ago. The woman in the silk dress leaned forward slightly, her expression no longer confident, her gaze fixed on the screen as though she were trying to rewrite what she was seeing. But truth did not bend, and it did not wait for comfort. And beside her, a man seated just one chair away stiffened almost imperceptibly, his hand lowering slowly from the table where it had rested too casually before, his posture adjusting in a way that suggested awareness rather than surprise. And it was in that subtle movement that everything became clear. Not through accusation, not through confrontation, but through the quiet exposure of what had always been there. Vincent did not react immediately. He did not point, he did not speak, because he did not need to. His silence now serving a different purpose, one that allowed the room to witness its own mistake without interference. And the weight of that realization settled heavily, pressing down on every person who had watched, who had assumed, who had allowed a conclusion to form without question. And at the center of it all, Alicia stood unchanged, her posture steady, her expression composed, as though the truth unfolding before them had always been something she trusted would arrive, even if she had not known how or when. The manager's face had lost its earlier certainty, the color draining slightly as he shifted his gaze between the screen and the guests, searching for something to regain control. But control did not return once it had been lost to truth, and when he finally spoke, his voice lacked the sharpness it once carried. "It appears there may have been a misunderstanding," he said, the words carefully chosen, but insufficient, because they did not match the weight of what had just been revealed. And Vincent's gaze moved to him, slowly, deliberately. "A misunderstanding," he repeated, and though his tone remained calm, there was a clarity in it now that cut deeper than any raised voice could have. "You dismissed her publicly," he continued, "without evidence, based on assumption." And each word landed with precision, stripping away the justification the manager had attempted to construct, leaving only the truth behind it. The woman in the silk dress lowered her eyes, her earlier confidence replaced with discomfort, her fingers now clasped together in her lap as though she were trying to hold on to something that had already slipped away. And around her, the guests who had once watched with quiet amusement now avoided meeting each other's gaze, because what had been entertainment had turned into something else entirely, something reflective, something that asked more than it answered. Vincent stepped forward once more, his attention shifting briefly toward the man seated beside the woman, the one whose movement had not gone unnoticed, and though he did not accuse him, did not call him out directly, the weight of his gaze was enough to settle the matter without words, because power, when it was real, did not require spectacle, it required only recognition. And the man understood, his posture stiffening further before he finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. "It must have fallen into my pocket when I moved the napkin," he said. The explanation, thin, unnecessary, but offered nonetheless, and no one challenged it, because the truth had already been seen, already accepted, and anything said now was simply an attempt to soften what could not be undone. Vincent nodded once, not in agreement, not in acceptance, but in acknowledgement that the moment had reached its conclusion, and then, finally, his attention returned to Alicia, and for the first time, there was something different in his expression, not just recognition, not just awareness, but something deeper, something that connected this moment to another, unseen, unspoken. And when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that belonged not only to the present, but to something that had begun long before this night. "You were not wrong to stand your ground," he said quietly. And though the words were simple, they carried more meaning than anything else that had been said that evening, because they restored something that had been taken, not just her job, not just her reputation, but her place in a room that had tried to define her without knowing her. And in that moment, as the silence settled once more, it was no longer empty. It was full, filled with the unmistakable presence of something that could not be ignored, something that demanded to be remembered. The room did not recover immediately, because moments like this did not allow for quick adjustments. They demanded stillness, they demanded reflection. And Vincent let that silence linger just long enough for everyone to sit inside what they had just witnessed, not rushing to fill it, not offering immediate resolution, because resolution without understanding meant nothing. And as he turned slightly, his gaze returning once more to Alicia, there was a shift that only she seemed to notice, something quieter than authority, something more deliberate, as if he were no longer seeing her as part of the situation, but as the center of it. "What is your name?" he asked, his tone no longer directed at the room, but at her, and though the question was simple, it carried weight, because it was the first time anyone had asked her anything that mattered that evening. And Alicia hesitated for only a second before answering, her voice steady. Alicia Carter, and the name settled between them. Familiar in a way that did not yet have explanation, but did not need one either. Not yet. Vincent nodded slowly, repeating it under his breath, as though testing it against something deeper, something stored far beyond this room. And for a brief moment, his expression shifted, not outwardly, not enough for others to fully read, but enough to suggest that the connection he had felt earlier was no longer uncertain. It was forming, piece by piece, and it was not coincidence. "How long have you been working here?" he continued, his questions measured, controlled, not invasive, but intentional. And Alicia answered without embellishment. 3 months, sir." Her posture unchanged, her tone neither defensive nor apologetic, simply factual. And Vincent studied her for a moment longer, as though weighing something beyond her words, beyond her presence in this room. And then his eyes moved again, briefly, toward the bracelet at her wrist. The worn metal catching the light just enough to draw attention without demanding it. "That bracelet," he said, not asking, but acknowledging. And Alicia glanced down instinctively, her fingers brushing lightly against it before she looked back up. "It belonged to my mother," she said quietly. "She gave it to me before she passed." And the room, which had been slowly exhaling after the tension of accusation, seemed to pause again, because this was no longer about a missing object or a misunderstanding. It was about something personal, something human, something that could not be measured by wealth or status. Vincent's gaze remained fixed on the bracelet for a moment longer, and then, almost imperceptibly, something shifted in him, something that reached back into a memory he had not revisited in years. A hospital corridor, sterile and cold, the quiet hum of machines, and a woman sitting beside a bed, holding the hand of someone he had almost lost, speaking softly, steadily, when no one else had known what to say. And though the memory was distant, fragmented, the detail that remained clear was the bracelet, simple, worn, unmistakable, resting against her wrist as she comforted someone who had not been hers to care for. And suddenly, the connection was no longer abstract. It was undeniable. "Your mother," Vincent repeated, his voice softer now, not weakened, but altered, carrying something that had not been present before. "She worked at St. Andrew's Hospital," he said, and it was not a question. And Alicia's eyes widened slightly, the first visible crack in her composed exterior. "Yes," she replied, quieter now. She was a nurse, and the confirmation settled into the space between them like a key turning in a lock that had been waiting for years to open. And Vincent nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging something that had finally come full circle. Around them, the room had grown still again, but this time the silence was different. No longer tense, no longer uncertain, but attentive, aware that something larger than the events of the evening was unfolding, something that connected past and present in a way none of them had expected. And Vincent took a step back, not distancing himself, but repositioning, as though the perspective had shifted entirely. Years ago, he said, his voice carrying just enough for the room to hear, but directed at her. Someone sat with my mother when no one else would, when the doctors had done all they could and left the rest to time. And he paused, not for effect, but because the memory itself required it. She did not know us. She did not have to stay. But she did. And his gaze returned to the bracelet once more before meeting Alicia's eyes again. She wore that same bracelet. He finished. And in that moment, the weight of everything that had happened that evening rearranged itself completely. Because what had begun as humiliation had turned into recognition, and recognition carried a kind of power that no one in that room had anticipated, least of all those who had been so quick to judge. And Alicia stood there, no longer invisible, no longer defined by accusation, but by something far greater, something that had been present long before this night, and would remain long after it ended. For a moment, no one moved, because the meaning behind his words did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, settling into the room like a truth that had been waiting far longer than anyone realized. And Alicia felt it before she fully understood it. The way the air shifted, the way the silence deepened, not with tension, but with something heavier, something almost reverent, and her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the cloth she still held. Not out of fear, but out of grounding, as if she needed something solid to hold on to while the world around her quietly rearranged itself. Your mother. Vincent continued, his voice lower now, more personal, as though the room itself had faded away. She stayed past her shift that night, and his eyes did not leave hers, because this was no longer a story for the room. It was a memory shared between two lives that had never expected to meet again. The doctors had already given their timeline. They had already prepared us for the worst, and everyone else left, he said, and there was no bitterness in his tone, only clarity. But she did not, and the words lingered, carrying with them something that could not be measured in time or obligation, something that existed only in the quiet choices people made when no one was watching. Alicia's breath caught, barely noticeable, but enough to shift her expression, because she remembered those nights, not clearly, not in detail, but in fragments her mother used to share, stories of patients she refused to leave, of families who needed more than medicine. And though she had been young then, though she had not understood the weight of those moments, she felt it now, standing here, in a room that had once reduced her to nothing more than an accusation. She used to say, Alicia began slowly, her voice softer now, but steady, that people remember how you make them feel long after they forget what you did. And as the words left at her, the connection between them solidified, not through recognition alone, but through understanding, through the quiet realization that the kindness given years ago had not disappeared. It had simply waited, carried forward in ways neither of them had anticipated. Vincent nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, as if the memory had finally found its place. And when he turned his attention back to the room, the shift in his presence was unmistakable, no longer just controlled, no longer just observant, but resolute, grounded in something that extended beyond this moment, beyond this space. You accused her, he said, his voice calm, but now carrying a weight that pressed against every corner of the room, directed not at one person, but at all of them. You dismissed her, humiliated her, based on nothing but assumption. And though he did not raise his voice, the impact of his words was sharper than any confrontation, because they reflected what had already been seen. What could no longer be denied. The manager shifted uncomfortably, his earlier authority now reduced to something smaller, something uncertain, and for the first time, he did not attempt to respond immediately, because there was nothing left to defend, no explanation that could stand against what had already been revealed. And around him, the guests who had once observed from a distance now found themselves part of the moment, part of the mistake, their silence no longer neutral, but complicit. Vincent took a slow step forward, his gaze moving across the room, not searching, not questioning, but settling, as if marking each person with the same quiet understanding. Respect is not determined by position, he said, and the words carried no dramatics, no flourish, only truth. It is revealed by how you treat those who have less power than you. And as he spoke, no one interrupted, no one shifted. Because the weight of that statement did not invite response, it demanded reflection. Alicia stood still, her posture unchanged, but something within her had shifted, not outwardly, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be undone, because the room that had once looked through her was now forced to see her, not as a role, not as a position, but as a person whose presence carried meaning far beyond what they had assumed. And Vincent turned back to her once more, his expression softer now, but no less certain. "You are not leaving tonight," he said, not as an order, not as a command, but as a statement that redefined everything that had come before it. And the room, which had once moved against her, now stood still around her, as if waiting for something they had not yet earned the right to understand. The words settled into the room with a quiet finality, and for a long moment, no one dared to challenge them, because they did not sound like a decision. They sounded like something already decided long before this night began. And Alicia felt it in the way the air shifted around her, no longer pressing down, no longer suffocating, but opening, just enough for her to breathe differently, to stand differently, as though the weight she had carried into this room had been seen, acknowledged, and finally lifted without her having to ask for it. The manager swallowed, his voice returning cautiously, stripped of the sharpness it once held. "Sir, if there has been a mistake, we can correct it," he said, the words careful, measured, but lacking conviction, because correction implied something small, something fixable. And what had happened here was neither. And Vincent's gaze turned to him slowly, not with anger, but with clarity, the kind that left no space for negotiation. "This was not a mistake," he said, his tone even, unwavering. "This was a decision, and the distinction landed heavily, because decisions carried intent, and intent carried responsibility, and there was no quiet way to step away from that." The manager's shoulders shifted slightly, the confidence he had worn earlier now replaced with something more fragile, something uncertain, and for the first time he seemed smaller, not physically, but in presence, as though the room itself had stopped supporting him the way it once had. And around him, the guests who had once observed without consequence now avoided his direction entirely, their silence no longer passive, but distancing, because no one wanted to stand too close to a moment that had turned against itself. Vincent did not raise his voice. He did not escalate, because he did not need to. His control over the room remained absolute in its quietness. And when he spoke again, his words were directed not just at the manager, but at the structure that had allowed this moment to happen. "Effective immediately," he said, pausing just long enough for the weight of the phrase to settle. "You will no longer represent this establishment in any capacity, And there was no dramatic reaction, no outburst, because the finality of it did not require one. It simply existed, undeniable. And the manager did not argue, did not protest, because something in the room had already made it clear that there was no ground left to stand on. A subtle motion from the security team followed, not forceful, not aggressive, but firm, guiding rather than removing. And the manager stepped back, his presence fading from the center of the room as quietly as it had once dominated it. And as he disappeared into the background, the space he left behind did not feel empty. It felt corrected. Vincent turned then, his attention returning fully to Alicia, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Because words were no longer necessary to define what had already been understood, but still, he chose them carefully, not out of obligation, but out of respect. "If you are willing," he said, his voice softer now, carrying a different kind of authority, one rooted not in control, but in intention. "I would like you to stay," and the simplicity of the offer carried more meaning than any grand gesture could, because it was not framed as compensation, not presented as repayment, but as recognition, as restoration. Alicia felt the room shift again, but this time it did not press against her. It moved around her, creating space where there had once been none. And she took a slow breath, her fingers loosening slightly around the cloth she still held, the same cloth she had used moments ago to clean a stain that no longer seemed to matter. And when she spoke, her voice remained steady, but carried something new, something that had not been there before. "I would like that," she said, not as acceptance of charity, but as acknowledgement of her own place in the moment, her own right to stand there without apology. Vincent nodded once, a small motion, but one that sealed the shift entirely, and then, almost as an afterthought, though it was anything but, he added, "And from this moment forward, no one in this room will question your integrity again." And the statement did not sound like a warning. It sounded like a fact, something already established, something already understood. And as his gaze moved across the room once more, no one challenged it, no one even considered it, because the lesson had already been learned in the quietest, most undeniable way possible. And Alicia stood there, no longer defined by the role she had walked in with, but by something far greater, something that could not be taken from her again, not in this room, not by these people, not after what they had all just witnessed. The room did not return to what it had been, because moments like this did not reset. They transformed, and as the quiet began to settle into something steadier, something more grounded, the evening continued, but not in the same way, not with the same careless ease it had started with, because every person present carried the weight of what they had witnessed, and that weight changed how they sat, how they spoke, how they looked at the woman who now stood at the center of the space, not as an object of attention, but as a presence that could no longer be overlooked. The pianist resumed fully, the soft melody filling the air once more, but even the music seemed different now, less like background, more like something intentional, something that acknowledged the shift without needing to explain it. And the staff, those who had watched silently from the edges, began to move again, but with a quiet awareness that had not been there before, their actions more careful, their glances more thoughtful, as though they too had been reminded of something easily forgotten in places like this. Vincent remained where he was for a moment longer, his posture unchanged, his presence still commanding without effort. And then, with a small gesture, he indicated for the service to continue, not as a return to normal, but as a continuation under different terms. And as he stepped back toward his table, the room adjusted with him, not out of fear, but out of recognition, because power had been displayed in a way that did not need to be repeated. It had already left its mark. Alicia stood still for a brief second, allowing herself to take in the space around her. The same room that had once pressed against her now opening in quiet acknowledgement. And she placed the cloth back onto the service cart, smoothing it carefully as she always did. Not because anyone was watching, but because that was who she was, consistent, composed. Grounded in small acts that defined her long before this moment. And when she turned, she did not lower her gaze this time. She did not retreat into invisibility. She simply moved forward, steady, present. Her steps measured as she returned to her role. Not diminished, not altered, but elevated in a way no title could provide. A guest at one of the tables hesitated before speaking, his voice quieter than it might have been earlier. "Excuse me," he said, not commanding, not dismissive, but respectful. And Alicia paused, meeting his gaze without hesitation, and in that brief exchange, something fundamental had changed, not just for her, but for him, because respect, once learned, did not easily fade, and she nodded slightly, acknowledging him with the same calm presence she had carried throughout the night. But now it was seen, now it was recognized, now it mattered. Across the room, the woman in the silk dress sat with her hands folded, her earlier confidence replaced by a quiet reflection that did not seek attention, did not attempt to repair what had been done with empty words, because some moments were not meant to be corrected with apologies. They were meant to be remembered, and she watched as Alicia moved through the room, not as a server defined by position, but as a person defined by something far greater, something that could not be measured by wealth or status, and for the first time she understood that clearly. Vincent observed it all without interruption, his gaze steady, not lingering, not imposing, but aware. And as Alicia passed by his table once more, their eyes met briefly, and nothing needed to be said because the understanding between them had already been established, not through words, but through action, through memory, through the quiet recognition of something that had come full circle in a way neither of them could have planned. The evening carried on, but it did not erase what had happened. It carried it forward, woven into every interaction, every glance, every silence. And as the final notes of the piano drifted through the room and the last of the glasses were cleared, there was a stillness that remained, not empty, not unresolved, but complete in a way that did not need explanation. And somewhere within that stillness, something had been restored, something that had nearly been taken without question. And as Alicia stood once more beneath the soft glow of the chandeliers, no longer invisible, no longer diminished, but fully seen, the room held onto that image just a moment longer, because it understood, finally, what it meant. And that night, without announcement, without spectacle, dignity stood exactly where it had always belonged, and for the first time, everyone saw it clearly.